Good evening, everybody. Today we have Steve Freeman and Kevin, who are going to introduce and discuss with you the report that it's called the Report on Constitutional Change and Political Reform, produced by Keir Starmer and Gordon Brown. So we're going to start off with Steve, who's going to give a brief overview of this report that's being produced, and then take questions and contributions from the floor. And then we're going to go further into an analysis of what it means and can we offer anything better than what the report's suggesting. So Steve Freeman, I'm going to go to you first to give everyone an overview of this.
Okay, Carol, I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing, I think, at this point, if I could. See what happens when I do that. Oh, it says the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh dear. I hope not. You should be able to share screen. No?
I'll try again. Oh yeah, there we go. We got it. It's come up. That's fine. So I'll hit that one. Share. Okay, that's where we want to be, if I can see it myself. Okay, comrades, so what I'm going to do, first of all, is just to try to describe, we're not critically in any particular way, I'll put obviously some comments in, describe this report and suggest its significance. And I'm going to do it by linking it to, I think, Labour's manifesto, linking it back to Labour's 2019 manifesto. And then I want to do, just using PowerPoints, put some of Brown's report in his own words on screen for you on PowerPoints. It's not always a good idea to put a lot of words on PowerPoints, but I've tried to take the introduction to each of the 12 chapters that he has, so that we can, I can just sort of briefly touch upon the themes that are there, you know what I mean, rather than just saying that. So I thought, by way of introduction, I just wanted to say that the present epoch, let's call it a hypothesis, that the present epoch in England, so I'm not going to talk about Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, particularly in England, involves a struggle between, let's call it old Britain, let's call it New Britain, and I'll throw in the Commonwealth of England into that mix, which I'll come back to later. Old Britain obviously is in a crisis of degeneration. And currently, then we've got a most reactionary Tory government, obviously, engaged in class war against the trade union movement and bringing in laws and bringing in the army to break strikes and all those other things. And so that's the context in which, as Carol's already said, on the 5th of December, Gordon Brown, Keir Starmer, along with Tracy Brabin, who's the Labour mayor of West Yorkshire, met in Leeds University to launch this report that Brown had been working on for quite a long time, with a whole number of mayors and other people in the commission. I think there's about 10 or 15 people in the commission. It's in the report itself. And as Carol's already said, it's called A New Britain, Renewing Our Democracy and Rebuilding Our Economy. It's a 155 pages document making 40 recommendations. And in launching this manifesto, in launching this report, Keir Starmer makes a number of comments. He says that in too many places, people are being held back by a system that hoards power in Westminster. And he says that political reforms, such as the abolition of the Lords, were fundamental to redrawing the British economy. So he's making a connection between politics and economics. The driving force of this report is a sense that politics is broken, that the economy is broken, and we need to fix, as it were, both parts. So Labour's plan to reform the constitution will, he says, end sticking plaster politics. He vowed to undertake a root and branch reform, he says, of the UK constitution, moving political power out of London, banning second jobs for MPs and abolishing the House of Lords. Now, we may wonder about whether he'll do any of that, but yeah, let's take him at his word for his starters anyway. So what I wanted to do was, I think, hopefully, let's have a check a minute. Yeah, I think I've got bullet points at this point. Some bullet points just say what are the things that he said. So I put the bullet points up there. These are the things from the report: the abolition of the 800-member House of Lords. I'm going to say abolition of it to replace it with a Senate of nations and regions. Then to have the devolution of power to nations, regions and local authorities. So it's very much about devolution. To reform the House of Commons by banning second jobs. That local government will be given more power to generate its own revenue. That devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will be granted more say. I don't know what more say is, but anyway. And then there will be laws to eliminate foreign and corrupt money from UK politics, enforced by a new anti-corruption commissioner. And just looking at that, I think it's important to say that there are some obvious things missing from that, even within its own framework. There's PR, and there's and a sort of slimmed down monarchy, I think, would all fit in. It could all run with that. But anyway, let's they don't mention those things. And I thought what was interesting was to compare that with the 2019 Labour Manifesto. So on the next little slide I've got here, I just put up this is it. Corbyn Labour's 2019 manifesto, which speaks of our democratic revolution. And I think the interesting thing for me is that most people don't know about this part of the manifesto. It wasn't a thing that became prominent at all. It was in there though, but you have to search around to find it. He's talking for a UK-wide constitutional convention, talking about the House of Lords reform with elected Senate of nations and regions, decentralized decision-making, strengthening our democracy, directly elected mayors being more accountable, more freedom of information, repeal of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act 2011, no MPs to have second jobs, more devolution for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And it's remarkably similar. The bits in green that I've highlighted there are the ones that don't appear to be in Gordon Brown's. So Gordon Brown doesn't speak of a constitutional convention. He thinks the Labour government can do this. So he doesn't envisage that. But I think the Tories might have repealed the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I don't think any of the ruling elites want more freedom of information anyway. So I think that's, but it is remarkably similar. The thing is that you wouldn't know this because Labour never made anything out of it in the 2019 manifesto. And although we in the LLA, in version 1, if you remember, did endorse the Labour's 2019 manifesto, we probably didn't realise that in doing that they were endorsing all these points over here, you know, and it's just a thought because it was so unknown, you know, they're not the things that were thought. But I think for me, the significance of it, I think the significance of it is it's unclear to me what programme Starmer's going to stand on. And fiscal conservatism and opposition to workers' pay demands and strikes, that seems pretty clear. But this Gordon Brown's plan for a new Britain, as it were, I think provides a missing piece of the jigsaw. I think Labour is shaping up to combine fiscal conservatism with a kind of liberal constitutional reform. So I think that the new Britain idea is going to become central to Labour's manifesto. And I might be wrong on that. It could be all junked and ignored and go in a waste paper bin somewhere, but I don't think so, because I think that Starmer needs something like this. And I think the situation requires something like this. I'll come back to that. But it does mean that this is going to play a central role in Labour. If it does play a central role in Labour's manifesto, then Labour Party members and trade unions will need to know what they're going to be arguing for. So that's why I think that we need to, on the left, to get our head around all this stuff, because I think it will become more prominent in what's going on. So let me just run through, if I could. The next PowerPoints are really just briefly trying to highlight some things from each chapter of the analysis that's made. How am I doing for time, Carol? Is that all right still? Doing okay, hopefully? Yeah. Well, here's chapter 1. So chapter 1 says, in this chapter we set out, so I'm using Gordon Brown's own words here, basically the beginning of each chapter. In this chapter, we set out the demand that set out the mood of our country as we face a multitude of crises under a government incapable of dealing with them or of delivering the change that people want. Our economy is falling behind. Our public services are struggling, he says. The people of Britain are losing their ability, losing their faith in the ability of our political system to deliver for them. Only a serious and deep-rooted plan for the future can reverse Britain's decline. I mean, that's quite sort of significant, those words, I think. So that's chapter 1, and the chapter 1 elaborates on that theme. And then chapter 2, if I go on there, in this chapter it says, we argue that whilst there are many immediate reasons for low growth, deteriorating public services and low political trust that bedevils Britain, each share a common underlying cause in the inherent unique imbalance, he says, in the UK's economy, which sees growth and prosperity concentrated in London and the southeast of England. Okay, again, we don't have to agree with all that, but I'm just saying that's basically what he's arguing. There is undoubtedly there's an imbalance in the way that England, particularly England, is working. We know that, the north-south divide. But then moving on, third chapter, basically, again, it's the same theme, that UK's extreme and unfair economic imbalance is exacerbated by the concentration of power in Westminster. So again, he's talking about the power concentrated in what we in Republican Labour would call the crown power, but what he's calling Whitehall, which our unreformed constitutional arrangements make possible. It's because of the failure of the constitution that allows this concentration of power, which he sees so damaging. And then the next point, 4, is he says, in this chapter, we set out how, in spite of deep and intertwined challenges that we face, there is a consensus across the country for a different way of doing things. I'm not sure there is a consensus, I must admit, but I haven't actually read the rest of that chapter to find out why he thinks that's true. But anyway, that's another task for another day. But anyway, a new Britain is waiting to be born based on our shared values and a clear desire for change. Well, I think there is a new something waiting to be born. It's dialectics that there must be something waiting to be born, but whether it's this particular thing, I don't really know, but that's another story. And then he has a chapter on the importance of innovation. I won't hang about on that, just innovation is very important, especially as we're in the 21st century. So that's always good to know, just to confirm what the year we're in. It's yeah. And then the next bit, moving on, is to say that now this is an interesting point. In this chapter 6 says the UK is at a constitutional moment, he says, and needs change comparable to the important shifts in power in the 19th and 20th centuries that widen franchise, reform, parliament, etc. Now, if you think about that, the 1832 Reform Act, the Chartist movement, the 1867 Reform Act, the movement around that, the suffragette movement for women's votes, that we're talking about kind of, if he's talking about that, he's talking about big shifts in political struggles. He says, again, our economy is faltering, our democracy has lost the trust of its people. And I've deleted the next bit, but he cites the Scottish referendum 2014 and the Brexit referendum 2016 as a sign of this loss of trust that people have in the system. And he goes on to say, and again, I'd agree with this, that Britain urgently needs a new government. He means a Labour government, of course. But he also adds to that, but if we are to transform our country, we must change not just who governs us, and this is the key thing here, but how we are governed. And that's what we're talking about when we're discussing constitutional change. It's not just who does it, but how, by what mechanisms, by what means. And that, I think, is, again, very important and significant. Next one goes, the UK, it makes the point, the UK is the most centralised of comparable countries because despite devolution to despite devolution to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, the largest part of the country, i.e. England, remains grossly over-centralised. So I think he's indicating there is a problem in the English system, the way it works in England. And he goes to say in this chapter, we set out how we're going to spread power and rebalance it all to the different towns, cities and regions, because we need a refocusing. The next thing deals with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. He gives them a special section. They're proud nations within the United Kingdom. They've got self-government. They've got a powerful parliament, I think he says there. But also they've got two governments. They've got fantastic government of their own, and then they're also sharing it with the rest of us. And Wales is the same. They've also got a distinctive proud nation and got their Senate and powerful legislature, and they've got two governments. But unfortunately, in England, we haven't got two. So there we go. That's different, an imbalance there reflected. And then keep going, comrades, because it's only a smattering. Our recommendations are for much greater decentralisation of power to different levels of government across the United Kingdom, and that we need greater autonomy. Not greater democracy, by the way, really, but greater autonomy. And I think we could hang around. The autonomy sounds very appealing. We all like the idea, oh, yeah, we could do our own thing. But we have to look at that, the use of words there in that. And that's 9, and then 10. Moving on to 10, he says, new faces are not enough to clean up politics. New rules and different ways of working are essential, restoring the public's trust in our political system. Now, he goes on to cite, all this corruption we've seen of the Tories and that's going on there is the fact that the system now appears to be very corrupt. And he's trying to address that in this chapter 10. So he's addressing, this is really a kind of way of addressing Westminster, I think. Cleaning up Westminster is what he's saying, what he's appealing for. And then 2 more to go, and then you can all come in and make questions and contributions. Our recommendations add up, he says, in chapter, this is 11, yes, that's right. Our recommendations add up to a radical change in the distribution of power in the United Kingdom, bringing political power close to the people whom it serves, so that their voices are properly heard, rebuilding trust in our political system, and ensuring every part of the country can have the same economic opportunities. It sounds a bit levelling up to me, another version of it though. But this redistribution of power, he says, requires radical reform at the centre of government. In both Whitehall and Westminster, to bring to an end once and for all the hyper-centralised system of government, which is at the root of so many of our political and economic. And again, he's not using the language of the Crown, but I would use the language of the Crown to explain that as well. And then the final point is this. He says that the United Kingdom will only succeed economically, politically, and socially if it harnesses the talents and listens to the voices of all the people, ensuring that no part of the country is left behind, ignored, or silenced. He then goes on to say the recommendations, and he concludes on this point, and I will conclude on this point. The recommendations of this report are long-term changes, the transformation of local economies, the building of a more powerful local and regional democratic institutions is going to take time, but he goes on to add a little bit more that we could do quite a lot in one Labour government. So although this is a long-term plan, he thinks that one Labour government could do most of the things that he's got in his report. So that's it. I think it's an important document. It's worth looking at, and I think it's going to come to our attention even if we haven't noticed it so far. So I'll end at that point, and hopefully we can see what comrades say.
Thank you very much, Steve. If you can stop screen sharing.
Oh yeah, stop screen sharing. Sorry. Yeah.
I can put some panelists up. So if you would like to make any comments or do any contributions, on that report that Steve's given us, on the actual report itself. I can see that Mike Hope has put his hands up, so I'm going to promote you to panelist. Mike?
Can I just say that Kevin, although me and Kevin have agreed, although I've done this kind of description, Kevin can do, it's not me answering necessarily, it's me or Kevin, just to say that point.
So there are a couple of people who want to ask questions, and hopefully they're coming on as panelists now. Yes, I can see them. So Mike Hope was the first one with his hand up. So Mike, can you put your video on, please? Mike?
It's coming. Yes, there we are.
Coming, jolly good. Okay.
Sorry, these things. There's 40-year-old laptops, so it's going on a wing and a prayer. Two things really, Steve, but they're kind of related, I think. And what you see here, and this is where Brown and Starmer come together in their fundamental Britishness and Englishness, and the limitations of what Brown is saying. I mean, there's this guff about innovation and Britain always having been, sort of a real centre of innovation. I mean, yeah, there's some truth to that. It's just, I think it's more a question of right place at right time, rather than the intrinsic character of British, English people. And indeed, many of them were Scots and Irish and sometimes like neither than Welsh. So, but actually, I think it's evident to me now that where innovation works in science, and the fusion announcement which is made today, I'm aware of a lot of work that's gone on in relation to this in universities across Britain. Now, many of the students are international, and this is the point. Innovation thrives where you have the best minds, not just the British minds, which are not intrinsically any better than any others, but the best minds from elsewhere as well. So, it's the practical underpinning of internationalism here, which I'm sort of getting at. And the other point where he shows his limitations, he rabbits on about, the virtues of the devolved states, but notably he doesn't say much about the north of Ireland, which he calls Northern Ireland, which they do, because frankly, as we know, if we know the whole question of the Irish struggle, it's an illegitimate statement, an illegitimate sectarian statement set out to preserve British domination through having an inbuilt Protestant majority. And now it is totally unstable because that majority is coming to an end. And also Brexit has made it no longer an attractive prospect.
Thanks very much, Mike. As Tony Beddoe, I'm going to bring Tony Beddoe in now.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well and good, thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes, Tony Beddoe in Swansea, in Wales. A recent member of the National Policy Forum in the Labour Party, and until recently Secretary of the Socialist Health Association in Wales, and still a member of the Central Council. That's by way of background. When I was looking at this, it came in line with some other work that we've been thinking of in various quarters, and it seems to me that the changes to what you might call the upper house or the revising chamber, in my world, would have three characteristics. First of all, it would be as it is at the moment in the House of Lords, it would be the major cauldron of revising legislation and challenging it and perfecting it and refining it and so on. Secondly, I think there is a case to be made for a significant proportion of that upper house to be elected by various bodies and organisations that Parliament itself would bless as an electorate. So, for example, Mike Hope was talking about universities. One could imagine academia in different forms having a vote to put into the upper house people with the skills and the knowledge of the forthcoming developments. There'll be charitable organisations, working organisations, and so on and so forth. And that indirect electorate would change probably every 4 years as new bodies would come on, and old bodies, less relevant, would drop off as electing bodies. But between them, they might cover, both geographically and in terms of society's needs, a fairly wide range of expertise that would be built into the revising element of the upper house. And the third thing that I would be looking to, and I think we've touched on it, is that the upper house would, as of right, be seen as an auditing and inspectorate body and a disciplinary body, and would take some powers that would need to be defined away from the Commons, so that the Commons would have to behave itself a bit better if it had to look to the upper house to oversee its work and comment, and if necessary, intervene in defined areas of intervention. I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony, and for keeping to a short, brief contribution. Thank you. I'm going to bring Ken in now, and then I'm going to bring Kevin in to deal with some of those comments. So, Kenneth, if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Carol. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. From what you've said, Steve, it's difficult to discern any particularly concrete or specific proposal in anything that Brown has written. If I can go to just one point, you mentioned there is no reference to PR in the document. Is there any reference to how people might be elected to these regional assemblies, if that's what they are, by first past the post, by single transferable vote, or by some other system? And is there further any reference to what form these assemblies, if that's what they are to be, might take? Would they be modelled along the lines of the Scottish government or the Welsh Assembly or some other model? So my basic question is, there are a lot of generalities in Brown's report. I'm curious to know if there is anything at all specific in it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. That's an excellent question. All right, I'm going to bring in Kevin now, and so that he can come in and answer some of these questions.
Well, I'll make, thanks, Carol. I'll make a response to some of them. And I think Steve should maybe refer to the points that Ken's just made, particularly. I did manage to read the report in a bit of a speed read, as it were, so the fine points and so on will probably escape me. I think what was interesting about the report was its presentation purely around the House of Lords question, and it was sort of flagged up along with some of the anti-corruption issues and the second jobs. And what I think is interesting about that is that discussing constitutions is something that is rarely done, except in relation to Scotland. It's rarely done in Britain, except as a product of a political crisis. And Steve made the point about the various extra parliamentary movements that created democratic change in the 19th and 20th century. And also he made the point that we don't have a similar sort of movement at the moment, or at least it's not so salient. So the idea of this being a moment for constitutional change is in one sense true, in that there are fundamental problems with the constitution. But in terms of it being, presented before the Labour movement and so on, it's pretty negligible. I mean, Steve made that point, I think, quite well. But I'd like to perhaps bounce off a little bit from what Tony said, which was quite not a technical, but quite a specific issue about the nature of the elected second chamber. What Tony actually described, if he's interested in it, he could look at it, was actually the second chamber of the Irish parliamentary system, the Oireachtas, and it's the Seanad, or the Senate, And it's elected by a system which was referred to in the 30s as vocationalism. And actually the connection between that and Mussolini's corporatism was not unintentional, I think. If you live in the Republic of Ireland, you have a vote for a second chamber if you come under various categories. Graduates of the universities, there's a labour panel in which labour organisations are represented, farmers, business, so on and so forth. And if you want to see how that operates, you can see that operating there. It is designed to represent civil society in the way that Tony describes. Now, I'm opposed to it for various reasons, one of which is the idea of sectionalizing society in that way, thinking of it as, particular interests, but also because I think historically, second chambers, particularly in the era of a mass democracy, do have, in theory, a revising function, but more often than not are a blocking mechanism or a potential blocking mechanism. We all know the struggles between the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the early 20th century that resulted in the Parliament Act of 1911. We may also remember some of the things that were done to the Labour government in the 1960s by the House of Lords on things like steel nationalisation. So I have both a sort of tactical opposition to second chambers, but I think perhaps more fundamentally, and this sort of takes us to the nub of the document, I think that the idea of democracy and indeed the idea of framing the way that we conduct our state, and I'll use the word state deliberately because it's one that very rarely appears in the document, is about some general principles, and those should be democracy and the idea of mandates from the population, from the citizens. In other words, that we're not looking for representation of interests, we're actually looking for the maximum of democracy. And some of the phraseology in the document certainly sort of tends that way, but I think its overall line is actually very much one of management, and indeed not of radical fundamental change, but in indeed a realignment of certain aspects of the current system. So that would be my critique of it. And I think the second chamber question is a good way to bounce off to show the limitations of the document. But I'll leave it there and let other comrades come in and we can perhaps develop that further.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Steve, do you want to answer any of the questions or contributions that were put?
Brief comments. Mike did mention Northern Ireland, and I think Northern Ireland is a part of the way that Northern Ireland, having settled its devolution thing in the Good Friday Agreement, is now in a major crisis because of Brexit. Brexit is a central part of all of this degeneration, as I would call it, of our democracy. I agree with Kevin on the question of the second chamber, and I think I didn't know about that example from Ireland, but that's very interesting of itself. I'm a unicameral person. I think we just need one chamber, and I think Scotland has got one chamber. It's got its parliament. It doesn't need to have a House of Lords. It's got the Privy Council. It's got the House of Commons. It's got the House of Lords, all having a say in what Scotland does, but Scotland could have a system of government basically with all power from the people going through the Scottish Parliament. It would just have to abolish the House, take away the legitimacy of the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the Privy Council, and then it would have a unicameral system. So like Kevin, I believe in a unicameral system. I think that's the most democratic way you can do, because the power has to come from the people and be concentrated in that one assembly, and that one assembly has to be the supreme body accountable to the people. And I agree with Kevin that the second chambers are usually to protect the ruling elites from the first chamber doing too many radical things, as the American Senate was. So there is a whole argument, do we want to have a second chamber or not? And obviously Gordon Brown says yes, he's trying to reconstruct it. I don't have, Ken, I haven't forgotten your one. I don't have, Ken, the answer. I'm going to have to go back and check that out because I don't have the answer of how he sees those regional assemblies. So I haven't read to be absolutely honest, I haven't read the whole the whole report fully yet. I'm trying to look at key bits of it and so on. So I think it's a very important question, Ken, but I'm afraid I can't provide you with an answer, but it is a very important question. I shall have a look, and I have on our group sent the report out for also for comrades to have a look at as well. So we have these are the bits we have to fill in. So sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Steve. So if we could move on, I see Ian Drummond would like to come in. If we can, I'm going to bring Ian in, and then I think if we can move on to more analysis, and could we come up with something better? Do we want to challenge this and put something better in place, or are we broadly quite supportive of this? So Ian Drummond is coming in now. Ian, if you could put your camera on, please.
Oh, now my camera, I think, doesn't work on here because I'm back on my laptop rather than my phone. So I think I'll just turn it off in case it's also making my signal of my voice worse. Apologies for not being able to be seen. This is actually it on now. Forgot about that.
Okay, well, we can hear you very clearly anyway.
Oh, that's good. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, on this unicameral thing, I think the idea that unicameral chamber is necessarily more progressive, I'm not so sure about. If we were to look at the recent history of Peru, including the very recent history in the last week or so, it's been quite a good blocking chamber itself, with a reactionary bloc within it. Also more closer to home in Scotland, the idea of all power to the Scottish Parliament is one of the things that unattracts me from the idea of Scottish independence. And although they haven't been able to get Westminster and so on off their back at one end, the SNP, they've very much soaked up power from the councils already made very weak by the Tories, made even weaker by the SNP, chronically underfunded, even comparative to the Westminster funding, and disempowered. And this idea of all power to Holyrood, as I say, is one of the things that the SNP vision of an independent Scotland, as far as I could see, is of the kind of fragmentary state that's come out of some of the collapses of countries on the continent of Europe, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and so on, that's seen as perhaps the small, perfectly formed nation state in one sense, but actually a fragment of something bigger and more viable, looked at from another perspective. And certainly in terms of Britain, if it was to stay together, I think having a second chamber representing the nations and regions, I agree with Kevin, the Irish idea of having these different panels of civil society. It's almost a similar idea to Mussolini's corporatism. I'm not saying it's actually fascist, but you can certainly see the overlap with some of those ideas of corporatism in the fascist state. Perhaps the elections for it are less rigged, but I don't agree with the general principle. And certainly Ireland, as it is now, I don't see why it would necessarily need a second chamber, though perhaps the ascension of the North could be smoothed by having a second chamber representing the regions in that way, North and South. Even Scotland, if it was independent, we do have a rich diversity of regions, especially out in the islands and the highlands and so on, all over the country, that could be represented, not just by, I'd argue, stronger local authorities, but in a second chamber representing the regions, but certainly in a state that should, I think, be federal at the British level. Then, like both the United States and the Soviet Union and other federal states, having a a second chamber representing the federal units, as well as a first representing the people as a whole, seems to make sense. So in that way, I don't see anything to particularly take issue with from Brown. It sounded like a surprisingly positive document after what we are usually getting from Labour these days. Obviously, it doesn't go nearly far enough. No talk of republicanism, but then there wasn't even in Corbyn's day. But my real worry about it is that with the record of the 10 pledges to the membership, is there any chance that even with a majority of 314, as the Telegraph are saying, that's 482 MPs. I had to look for another, so the Telegraph saying to get a majority of 314, I couldn't do the arithmetic, and I had to go to the Independent to see how many MPs he's predicted to get by that poll, 482 to 69 Tories. Even with, perhaps especially with a big majority like that under the current system, how much of a chance is there that Keir Starmer, a statal figure, will do any of these things? And Gordon Brown, he actually could have done some of them when he was Prime Minister, and we wouldn't have been in this mess with the Tories for the last dozen years, because they wouldn't have been able to get a majority if there was constitutional reform, PR that Brown could have brought in. So, yeah, I think maybe Steve's right that this is an adjunct to the fiscal conservatism, but maybe it's just another promise that will get broken. And I think in terms of if we don't want Scotland and Wales to go their own way, I think there's some positives about regional and national representation in the second chamber. Certainly getting rid of the unelected and hereditary is better than nothing. But in terms of whether we can trust Starmer to do it, or whether the latest Labour Party election broadcast, which was not just the worst politics I've seen in the Labour election broadcast, but the worst presentation of any broadcast, the one on NATO, the polls on Normandy apparently being the beginning of NATO, not like Poland went on to join the Warsaw Pact or anything. It's really something to be watched in order to be believed. So cringeworthy. Whether that or this relatively progressive, if not obviously going far enough, reforms in this report, which way does it point for Labour? I don't know, but Keir Starmer's not given me much reason to be optimistic so far. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thank you. Right, quite a lot there for you to get your teeth into, I think there. So I'll go to Kevin first and then to Steve.
Thanks, Ian. Some good points there. I want to perhaps though reiterate something I said previously, and I think it's what we might call the first principles of the document. And that is that when you're drawing up a constitution, and I've explained, I said, that historically that was often linked to either revolutionary movements or great constitutional movements. And what strikes me about this is that it's very much a sort of redrafting and recalibration of the existing structures, so, modifications. And why I say that is that although there is a lot of talk about the left behind and the lack of trust in politics, and something of a crisis, the sort of definition of the crisis is very much, as it were, of someone from the top looking down and seeing that the plebs out there don't seem to like the way this system's going. How can we perhaps do something? In other words, in many ways, it's pretty well in the tradition of British constitutional politics, which is you make concessions when you have to, and those are usually forced upon you. Why I make the point about first principles, and Steve has really dealt with this very well, but I do want to emphasize it, is of course that is what's missing in this, and this is the idea of the Republic, and the idea in the Republic of where power comes from. Because what we've been talking about in second chambers or particular representations, we, all rests on the idea of who legitimates an institution, who legitimates an elected authority, wherein does it derive its sovereignty and its basis. And what's missing from this is an assumption that certain parts of the current system are legitimate, or indeed are so legitimate that they're not mentioned, and in particular the monarchy. But I don't, as Steve and I and other comrades have discussed here before, we're not talking about either the person or the monarch. We're actually talking about the executive power of the crown embodied in the prime minister. And that is, to me, does seem to be a really gaping hole. So when we're talking about, cleaning up Westminster, or we're talking about an anti-corruption commissioner or whatever, we're not really looking at the concentration of power. When the Brown report says, "Oh, let's devolve power out to the regions," or "there's too much power in Whitehall," he doesn't make either a constitutional argument about power must reside, resides in a sovereign people, or authority resides in a sovereign people, who delegate that to a representative democratic system. So I think, that sort of first principle that you would get in all the great constitutional declarations, we the people, as it were. And that's clearly sort of missing, I think, in this. On the second chamber question, I think that what Ian's got to consider is, you're looking at representation, Ian, of all parts of a country in representative institutions. And I think that can be achieved by a federal republic, by giving Scotland and Wales much stronger powers, but also, of course, if necessary, the right of self-determination and to form a separate state. But you're also talking about that power being concentrated in the localities, so that, for example, you would want much stronger local governments. And I would stress not elected mayors, because one of the things that I think is weak in this, and it is based upon the experience of mayors, is that the elected mayor system does have the tendency to, again, reinforce presidentialism, and it tends to have the mayor as a sort of interlocutor, as a mediator between the central power and the locality. So I think localities, however we want to define them, should have much stronger powers, tax-raising powers, indeed, much greater controls in that way. But for me, it's the sort of first principle that's lacking here. And I think that the second chamber would, as we know, set up questions of legitimacy of the first chamber. That was certainly the issue up until 1911, which was the superior chamber. And I think we have to establish these first principles of the sovereignty of the people, and work from there. So I think the discussion is good, and I think we do need to develop it. Those of us on the left do need to take this question seriously. I think a large part of the left will just dismiss it as sort of play acting or irrelevant. There's a big strike movement. This is not really relevant at the moment. But talking about the nature of the state and the way that power is distributed, and above all, the power that we should have over our lives, I think is important. It is a fundamental political question. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I have another attendee who's got his hand up, Alan Story. He's coming. He's accepted the invitation to a panelist, so he's coming in. But Steve, I'm going to give you a chance now to also come back on some of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping they will still get. I know we're using a lot of time now, but I'm hoping to get a chance to just make an alternative case. But I want to answer what Ian said. I didn't say all power to the Scottish Parliament. I would say all power to the Scottish people, because that's what a republic means, in the way that Kevin's sovereignty has to reside with the people. And those people have to be able to control their parliament by making it elected, making it accountable, making it subject to recall, as measured by the fact we only get the average wage, whatever that is. They're not rising above the average income of the people that they're representing. So the Scottish Parliament would have to go in that direction. It wouldn't go in that direction unless the Scottish people decided they wanted to go in that direction, by the way, which leads me back, I think, to a point, a really important point, because I was only really talking about England, not so much Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, because the democratic movements and the democratic demands that are there are on a different level to what they are in England. There isn't really a democratic movement in England. I don't think we can see it. The fact that people went for PR in a bigger way, I think, is significant. So there's things are happening, by the way, but there's nothing you could call there be a democratic movement. And in a sense, without a democratic movement, of course, this report will probably be binned. If there was a democratic movement, even a more radical democratic movement than here, they'd be rushing this report into operation to try and stop it. So if we want any of these things, don't follow the Brown so much, is develop a movement of people that are actually going to politically challenge this, as opposed to them handing it down through the existing power structure, which will decide, you know what, we can't do a bit of this and we can't do that, and before you know AI, it'll be in the bin. So I think so I think that the point about the 19th century, the real point about the 19th century, or the point that Kevin already made this point, but you have to have mass movements, you have to have mass democratic movements, even revolutionary ones, to be able to do that. Devolution, and I would make this point, devolution is the devolution of crown power. It's not, the crown isn't giving up its power, it's simply putting it down somewhere and then can take it back if it needs it. Because the slogan that I used for Brown was the devolution revolution, but that was a slogan of George Osborne. He started talking about that because he wanted to hand power from the crown to local authorities so they would become responsible for making the cuts in all the budgets and things that he was doing. So devolution sounds exciting, interesting, we're going to get more power, but it's really, watch what it is. It isn't, then the crown isn't really giving up its power at that point. It's just deciding to reconfigure it a little bit, but always keep it, I think. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve. We have someone from the floor who'd like to contribute, and then if I can, I know that both of you will probably want to talk about an alternative and what we can push for over and above what's in the report. So I'm just going to go to Alan, quickly bring Alan in, and then I'm going to go back to Steve and Kevin for what they would like to suggest. Alan, you're muted.
Right, just a second. Okay. Unmute myself, right. Hi, folks.
Hi.
I just heard about this thing 5 minutes ago, just jumped in, and happy birthday to me. It's my 75th birthday today.
Happy birthday.
I just like to make a couple of points, is that what this report does not include, and it includes nothing on voting. I mean, it's the most strange constitution that somehow we don't talk about sort of a pretty basic part of some kind of democracy, which is voting. And in particular, we don't talk about what a crappy voting system we have now in the country, that being something that was all very well in the 1800s when voting was about choosing between your local squire, A or B. Things have a little bit moved on. Women couldn't vote in 1884 when this all came in. Things can have sort of moved on a bit. And when he was running for leader of the Labour Party in January 2020, and I pull out the clippings, but we don't need to do that, Starmer said, A, he would consult with members of the Labour Party about electoral reform, and B, that he would set up a constitutional commission that would do that, that being one with Gordon Brown, the man who became prime minister as a result of a voting system where at the end of the Iraq war, Brown and Blair came to the top for the third time on 35% of the vote. And Brown has never liked a proportional representation, a fair voting system. And I would suggest that the only scenario I can see of any kind of serious upsurge in the left Republican movement in the next 10 years is going to be, in fact, by proportional representation. And then it might be possible, if you have a decent PR system, that, for example, you could then have a left party be elected and have a situation, for example, like in Finland, where Finland was created in 1917. Their very first election was based on proportional representation. So now in Finland, you have a 5-party coalition, one of those running the government, all the parties incidentally, or not incidentally, headed by women, and 4 of the 5 under the age of 35. It's almost kind of, can you even think of the idea? But there is a left party there called the Left Alliance, which in the 2019 election got 8% of the vote. That means under PR, they got 8% of the seats. So in fact, then in Finland, there is 16 Left Alliance MPs out of a legislature of 200 seats. And this is the only way that a serious left movement could get electoral power of any influence. And obviously there's more to politics than simply running in elections, to be very clear, but there is a value in having left MPs in parliament. And that is not going to happen while we have first past the post. Well, it's first past the post in Canada, where I'm from, in the United States and Britain, the big 3 are 2-party monopolies. They're duopolies, where you just switch back and forth. In Canada, it's liberal, conservative. In this country, it's Labor, Tory. In the United States, Democrats, Republicans. And it's not a coincidence that in over 100 years in this country, no party has ever finished first or second, except for the Tories and Labor. Canada, the same way. United States, Canada, since 1867, when the bloody country was formed, has only had 2 parties. United States, 2 parties. And I suggest this is the way that it would be possible, especially if Starmer keeps taking the Labour Party more and more to the right, that a good left party could be formed. And that party, say headed maybe by a Zara Sultana, a Clive Lewis, or someone else, who are left social democrats. They're not revolutionaries. I don't know. They're probably Republicans. Would have a chance against the Starmer-led Labour Party of getting 5, 6, 7% of the vote. It's really quite realistic. There's a big move out there. There's 200,000 who left the Labour Party. There's all kinds of people very fed up with the Green Party and its trans fundamentalism. There's all kinds of people who feel on the left who have no political home. But Starmer says, I was just reading today, those votes are, if you're on the left in this country and you want to vote, who do you vote for? There's no vote that has any impact under first past the post. But if we in fact had a proportion,
Alan, I hate to interrupt you on your birthday, but can we draw this to a close?
Oh yeah, sure, I'll draw the curtain. But I suggest that I don't want to overblow it as a movement for democracy, but that Steve was talking about, but that this is a movement of the left seems to shun this idea of proportional representation. I think it's in fact a winner to in fact make a change in the political system.
Okay, yes, I think I would agree with you there, Alan. Thanks very much. Okay, can I now go back to Steve to chat about that?
Just on that particular question, well, I think in general terms, proportional representation is more democratic, but I think that's not the fun. And there is clearly a movement for it because people are dissatisfied with democracy and they're thinking PR might be the answer to it. But I think the problem is much deeper and much more fundamental than that. So, for example, I myself think we should have a completely new parliament elected by PR, and we should reduce the number of parliaments we've got. We should get rid of the Privy Council. We should get rid of the House of Lords, and we should get rid of the House of Commons. All three of them don't function properly. So I think that, yes, a parliament for England elected by proportional representation, that would be a step in the right direction. But that's it's not about making the House of Commons more democratic, because I think the House of Commons is itself a failing system. We look at the House of Lords and think that's a joke, but I think the House of Commons have got many of the same problems. It's almost like something that's getting in the way of seeing the problem. So I think we have to have a whole new look at that. And I don't think PR would be anything other than the collapse of the system rather than the resurrection of it. So I'd be wary of it, let's put it like that, even though in general I'm in favour of it.
Right. Can I go to you, Kevin, then now for your analysis of this whole report? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think there's something better that we can offer? Should we support it? Should we not? Those sort of important questions. Over to you, Kevin, and then to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Carol. I think that it opens up a discussion, but I don't think we can really support it for a number of reasons. One of which is, of course, the question of the Republic, which I have explained is not solely about the person of the monarch. In fact, it's not about the person of the monarch at all. It's about executive power, a sort of prime ministerial presidentialism, and the concentrations of executive power in very few hands. So the crown prerogatives are exercised by a presidential prime minister, and that is really fundamentally missing from this. I think the other question, which again I've mentioned in previous replies, but I think it is important for us as socialists, is that we regard democracy and the idea of the sovereign power of a democracy as really being quite central. They're not sort of add-ons, they're not nice things to have if you can get them. And that's because, certainly my view is that socialism is about the popular control, not only over government, but over the economy and over society. So there's really quite a lot missing in this. And although it makes some critiques of the system, and it does that, in a very common way that's common now with certain commentators on the left, and indeed not even just commentators on the left or in the liberal sections of society. What I think it really lacks is any sense of the way that society can be transformed. So although it talks about a new Britain, it talks about a new constitution, it talks about a new way of running things, what is missing, for example, is a real attack upon the economic and the political power of the ruling class. So that, as I think Steve made the very valid point, that devolution of crown power, that power is still dependent upon the authority, not of the people, but of this executive crown. But perhaps more importantly, and it certainly was the case that the mayors, particularly in Northern England, were really just given quote devolved power so that they could bid for money and then have to justify the decisions. And when it came down to quite fundamental issues, particularly transport, which is a burning issue in this part of the world, it couldn't do anything. They didn't really have that power. The same with tax raising powers, and of course the functioning of the mayors. So much of this for me is not window dressing. I think that it in many ways it asks the questions, but the replies it gives stay pretty firmly within the constitutional status quo. Lastly, although it does link the economy, and the front cover of the report talks about that this is designed both to rebuild trust in the population, in other words, to rebuild the authority of the present constitutional structures and the real concentrations of power. It does this in the name of an economic strategy. And again, I think this is just so much window dressing when the real levers of economic power, but whether they be locally, whether they be in the nations and the regions, or indeed over the whole of Britain, that they don't really challenge that. They assume with the talk about growth points, about regional innovations and so on, they assume essentially the continuation of a capitalist economy. And in capitalist terms, while we have the rationale of the market and of production organized for profit, the sort of jobs that and the sort of work and indeed the sort of social functions that government and local government should have are not going to be evenly distributed. The financialization of British capitalism creates that power base in London and the Southeast. There's a very good reason, why that exists, and without really, I suppose, revolutionary change. And I don't use that word, as a sort of throwaway bit of rhetoric, then that's going to remain there. The dynamics of capitalism have created that type of economy, and these measures really will be, as I think Steve said at the beginning, just another version of levelling up. In terms of our alternative, I think we have to make the Republic central to that. We also have to make the idea of democracy and popular control at all levels. So we start with that idea of democracy, and the last comrade's contribution about PR is important in that regard. He's quite right that PR would give representation, and it would allow, I'm sure, different voices, particularly those on the left, to be heard, politically and in society more widely. But I think what we really are arguing for is something much more fundamental than just a voting system, important as it is. We're talking about a way that we understand society and we understand our relationship as individuals, as citizens, not only to the government structures, but to society more general. And so democracy and socialism and the idea of that sort of change, I think really has to be fundamental. So I think we have to, criticize this report, but use the report and the discussions that come out of it to raise these questions. Not, I think, to get too distracted by, the minutiae, and we should look at the minutiae because it adds up to an overall picture. But we need an alternative that particularly links the struggle for democracy, the struggle for socialism, and economic and political transformation together. And that's, to me, is what's missing from the document.
Thank you very much, Kevin. If I can ask Steve to also come in with his analysis now.
Okay, thank you, Carol and Kevin. And I agree with essentially what Kevin said. I think there are some differences between us, but generally we are singing from the same sort of song sheet about the importance of republicanism. But what I want to do is I want to sort of dive into history for a minute, very briefly, because I won't talk too long. But I think if we're going to understand the present, we have historical materials, and we have the idea that we must go back into the history of the class struggles, in order to understand what is going on in the present epoch, the present period. And I do want to categorize or try to characterize what the present epoch that we are living through since 2008. But I want to go back further. I think if we really want to understand what's going on, we have to go back to the revolutionary 17th century, the last time that we had a revolution, and see what went on there. And then I think we have to come updated very quickly to 1945. And I think we've got to get those two contexts to really understand the way that we must go. And it's worth just remembering, let's just go back to the 17th century for a minute. It seems so long ago. Let's remember that in 1649, we had a democratic revolution. We established the Commonwealth of England. The Levellers came forward, the Leveller Party, with an agreement for a written constitution. There was a new model army that was almost like a citizens' army, etc. Now we know that revolution was defeated. A kind of democracy was gained and lost almost at the same time. So we're living as a consequence of that. And what we got instead, so that revolution was defeated by Cromwell's counter-revolution. And then Cromwell took the new model army to Ireland, and he took the new model army to Scotland to bring them into line, as it were. That was the counter-revolution that Cromwell carried out. But if we go ahead a little bit to the end of the 17th century, I would call it, it's called the Glorious Revolution. I think want to call it the Orange Revolution, and the so we had the Leveller Party there in the middle of the 17th century. Here we have the Orange Revolution and the Whig Party, which established between 1688 and 1707, established the foundations of our present constitution, a constitutional monarchy based on the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament and the union of with Scotland. Wales was already incorporated, and Ireland was to join the union, become part of the union, or it was part of Britain at that time in 1801. There was no democracy. It was an instrument of the Whig aristocracy, which established the Bank of England, built the British Navy, launched the slave trade, and expanded the colonial empire. And it's that constitution that gave us the two-party system of Tories, the Conservatives, and who wanted to preserve the existing constitution, and the Whigs who wanted to change or reform the constitution in order to preserve it. So here we are over 300 years later, we've still got the constitution of the Crown in Parliament and the Union. They're still the fundamental principles of the rule of law, our constitutional law. So I would argue, or put to you the idea that the Labour Party reflects that constitutional birthright as a broad church of Whigs and Levellers. And if we think of the Labour Party as being the party of Whigs and Levellers, then Gordon Brown is the latest in a line of Whig or liberal reformers, accepting the fundamentals of all the fundamentals of the Constitution, the Crown in Parliament, the monarchy, the Union, and all those other things. Tony Benn, on the other hand, was a leveller. That's why he used to go to Burford every May to celebrate those events, and that's why he wrote his Constitution of Commonwealth Bill. The Corbyn 2019 manifesto, therefore, even though Corbyn himself had Republican ideas, was really a Whig programme. So that's why you can't see much different between the Brown and the 2019 manifesto. A modern Whig would say, a modern reformer would say, reform the House of Lords, reform the Commons, maybe bring in PR, devolution of power, reform the monarchy. Not all those things have been said. Modern levellers, I think, would say the Commonwealth of England, a democratic and social republic, abolish the monarchy, abolish the Lords, the agreement of the people, a written constitution, and end the Union. And I think those people who are saying that today are the heirs of the levellers, as the people that are following Gordon Brown and Keir Starmer are the heirs of the Whigs from the settlement of 1688 to 1707. Now, the Crown in 2022 is very different from what it was in the 17th century. And as Kevin said, it's been transformed by the Industrial Revolution, by the creation of the working class, by the rise and fall of the British Empire and 2 world wars. It has massive power. It concentrates massive, the Crown concentrates massive power. In a way, it's a political representation of the permanent rule of financial capital, which is missing from this story, the City of London, at the very centre of government. And that power is concentrated in the hands of the Crown, i.e. ministers and senior civil servants in Whitehall. And this machine is a bit like a vacuum cleaner, sucking out the capital and the surplus value, and then redistributing it to make sure it serves the interests of the rich and powerful, and hence supports the financial markets and the big corporate monopolies. And we cannot deal with any of those things if we don't deal with the constitutional power of the Crown. Now, let us just very quickly go through 1945, 1979, and come up to 2008 in a few seconds. 1945, as a result of the Second World War, we ended up with let's call it a social and constitutional monarchy. In other words, a welfare state under the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, and all the reforms, setting up of the NHS and all the things we know about. The 1945 constitutional and social settlement, which lasted until 1979 when Thatcher then, well, to the mid-70s, but then was dismantled after 1979 by Thatcher. And that dismantling and destruction of that social and constitutional monarchy is carried on by Tony Blair, carried right on till the financial crash of 2008. It still exists. We still have an NHS. We still have some elements. But since 2008, since the austerity policies of 2008, that whole system has now degenerated into a serious crisis. And that degenerated social monarchy, okay, manifests itself in a crisis of our democracy, because it's not just a crisis of the welfare state, it's a crisis of the political system. As a result of that, a loss of trust that Brown talks about in his thing, the loss of trust. People don't believe in the system anymore, in the system of democracy anymore, it's failing them. And that crisis of democracy, the breakdown of the political system, means that what we're getting in the current situation is both anti-democratic and pro-democratic tendencies as a result of that. We can see the anti-democrats who want more authoritarian rule, the concentration of more power, the assault on the rights of people, not least the rights of workers and their trade unions. And we can see the growth of anti-democratic tendencies in the Tory party and obviously in the far right, etc. But where are the pro-democracy tendencies? And I think you could look to Ireland, to Scotland and Wales, but what is going on there? But also in England, we've seen the Labour Party conference passing the resolution on proportional representation. Now we see Brown's report, all addressing the crisis of democracy. So I think this whole report doesn't make sense if we don't understand the deep failure of our political system and our constitutional system, as well as the failure of our economy. That's why it's not easy to put it in the bin, because the crisis it propels people to one side of that struggle. So I'm going to come back then to the 17th century, come back to the Commonwealth of England, and say that that's where we need to find our answer to this problem, going back to the 17th century. It's not a new Britain that we're waiting for, I believe, but a Commonwealth of England. That's what we need to do. We need to basically, that's something that has to be built from below as people take matters into their own hands. Tony Benn, as I said, was a leveller, and his bill presented to Parliament, he used the term Commonwealth. The meaning of the Commonwealth is a republic, but it's more than just a republic. It's a republic with a welfare state that's going to deal with the questions of health, all the things that Corbyn was talking about. So I think that now we can use the term Commonwealth as a synthesis of a republic and a welfare state, or a fully democratic welfare state. I'm probably going to finish there, but I would make this one point, that England has a particular problems that Gordon Brown refers to, having the largest democratic deficit, covering 85% of the population. And therefore the working class movement in England has to take a lead in closing that deficit and taking democracy much further and more deeply and more quickly than before. And the working class in England, as part of that, must renounce any claim to determine the constitutional future of Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So, and therefore we must make our attention to the kind of democracy we want to see in England. And that's what the Commonwealth of England should be about, is the way that Ben mentioned it and the way we should envisage it. There won't be an old Britain, there won't be a new Britain, there won't be a British Empire, there won't be a British Union, there won't be a British Army, there won't be the British Crown, British imperialism, the Union Jack, or indeed British nationalism. That's a radical answer that we need to find, a democracy built from below. And that democracy, I think, will have close relationships with Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and indeed the rest of Europe, including possibly a federal republic. But it's the route to get there that's important. I'm going to stop at that point.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. I think, well, that was pretty revolutionary, I think, way beyond reformism. One question that I'd like to ask is, what you're talking about, is that going to offer much better outcomes for people than devolving the power to the provinces? How are the two, what you're describing and the devolution that Gordon Brown and Keir Starmer are describing, how is that different?
You want to answer that now or just to go? I mean, I think you've got to have, if I could say it now, I think democracy's got to come below. It's got to come through citizens' assemblies, and it's got to come through regional assemblies, an assembly being different from a parliament, not with lawmaking powers. But you need one democratic assembly for the whole country to make one law on all those things for the whole country. So we need a plan, we need a democracy for everybody, and we need regional assemblies and local citizens' assemblies as part of a new constitution. But the real thing is that the power has to come from below, not to be devolved. So I think that power coming from local and in workplaces, by the way, we want democratic assemblies in workplaces as well as in local areas and in regions. I think there are 9 regions. I think I would like to see there being regional assemblies, but there should be one parliament, one democratically centralized parliament to make one law for the whole country. So we're not going to have different health and safety laws if you live in the northwest or you live in the northeast or you live in London. So the basic laws of the country are made by one parliament for everybody.
Thank you very much, Steve. Kevin, would you like to come back?
Yeah, I think my answer to you, Carol, would be that that the very word devolution, for the reasons that we've discussed, suggests sort of power being handed out, a devolvement of power, a devolution of power from the centre. And I think that we take power, emanating in constitutional terms from the citizen. But I think more importantly, and again, there is a degree of overlap between Steve and I, we're looking at democracy throughout society. In one of our previous discussions, I think involving Mike McNair as well on the monarchy, we were talking about the way that capitalism as a system reinforces forms of monarchism, whether they're in so-called republican forms, in the form of managerialism or in the form of somebody sort of dictating, a leader, whether it be a leader of the Labour group, a leader of the Labour Party, or indeed a monarch or other sort of centralizing figures. And I think that we have to build politics that is based upon ideas of democracy that takes away the focus from individuals and concentrations of power, in the various ways that we've talked about, the recall of parliamentarians, the salaries that they work on, the issue of elections being frequent, and so on. So it's a wider idea of democracy, and it's one that is revolutionary for many of the reasons that both Steve and I have said. But it's also, I suppose, a different conception of society. And why I make the historical points, and Steve's made some, but if you look at all of the great revolutionary movements, they had a set of general principles that all amounted to the idea that power comes from the people who make up this political association and make up this political community. And that's the idea. We're not taking a ready-made community, we're developing our own. And that will be in both the localities, but also the nations as well. I'm in favor of a federal republic and giving the right of self-determination, recognizing that Scotland and Wales and indeed England as well, for that matter, has the right to form a separate state. But I would argue, for various historical and economic reasons, that a Republic of Britain, I think, would be the best solution. I am also in favour of the reunification of Ireland, in that way. So I've not talked at all about the north of Ireland, but it's important, I think, to sort of stress that we're in favor of the sort of maximum ideas of democracy, but that has to be more central to what we're doing, Carol. You know, when we've been in discussions in the LLA or elsewhere, I mean, we often do talk about the economy, or we talk about anti-union laws and so on, and, you know, they're all important subjects. But I think what we have to sort of regain is this idea of a democratic movement, but also of a democratic society, you know, and that goes in the workplace, you know, goes in schools and universities and so on. So we have to really fight for that, and the structures that we have should then reflect it. So I'm, you know, for the reasons that Steve outlined quite well, I'm not in favor of the idea of devolving power. I'm the idea of where power comes from, and you know, and that is quite a radical idea. You know, for example, I was thinking this morning, listening to Mick Lynch, having a tussle with various TV commentators, and they were pointing out that the percentages of people who'd voted for a particular action, and you know, we did reasonably well fighting back against them. But one thing he could make the point is that not only are the percentages that the Tories get, or indeed any British government gets, of both the electorate and of the population as a whole, often lower than the majorities that he has secured for action. But perhaps more importantly, who elects the chairman of the board of companies? Who elects all the important institutions? So if we're talking about mandates, you know, they've got the mandate of the market, and we've got the mandate of the people. And I think that's what we should be really pushing home on this. And as I say, this discussion is good because it's one that we rarely have. But I think we have to sort of move away from, you know, and these are all important points, but they need to be fitting home. We need to move away from maybe the minutiae of the structures, and then think of the principles, and then think of how we would organize that. And also to really challenge the basis on which this document works, you know, in that way. And, you know, Steve and I have attempted that in different ways. And I think that's really where the discussion goes, because we're talking about power in our society and questions which are just never ever mentioned about who appoints people, where this power comes from, you know, and that's really what the nub of republicanism and, you know, a really republican democracy, you know, which permeates the whole of society, you know.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. I think we've had an excellent discussion tonight, and I think from what I can gather, there is critical support for this, and the chance to get in there and talk about it, discuss it, and hopefully go a lot further than this report is allowing us to. I think Steve wants to. Steve just wants to come in.
I noticed in the chat, just looking at the chat, I noticed somebody was saying, well, what about climate change, which never got discussed at all? Well, many things didn't get discussed. But what I would say is this: I think solving that problem is a global problem, and it cannot be solved in one country. That's the problem. You need to deal with capitalism as a global system. It's capitalism that's driving it, and capitalism is a global system. But that doesn't mean that you can do nothing in one country. That we just sit here because until global capitalism has been abolished, what the hell can we do? No. What we're saying is that democracy in this one country, if we could win a battle for democracy in this country, we wouldn't solve the problems of global climate change, the planet burning down, but we would become a beacon or an example for others to follow. We would do a hell of a lot more if power passed into the hands of the people. The people and the scientists and the people who know about this stuff would have much, much more power. So we can't solve it in one country. But the idea of a republic is not that we are, as Republican, our idea of a fight for democracy is we're not interested in climate change is ridiculous. Because the problem we've got is with the political system that we've got, we can't make any serious progress in this country because the political power is with the banks and the City of London in the form of the Crown. So we are talking about climate change, even if we never mentioned it. And how do we have a strategy for dealing with that? And our Republican democracy is not the solution, but it takes us in the right direction. It would take us to something much more radical than has happened to this point. I'll just finish on this point because it's a long session. I agree with Kevin. I think my difference with Kevin, just to highlight it, is I agree with Kevin that I would like to see a federal republic of England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, we're agreed on that. I've had that position for a long time, in decades even maybe. What I've come round to think is that with the route we're going to get there is how we get there. That's the difference. And I believe that we must get there through England actually stepping up to the plate and taking its democracy forward and not imposing itself on the Irish and the Scottish and the Welsh, and that we will get closer relationships between the Irish, Scottish, Welsh and English people if England renounces any claim over those countries. And if they become republics, then the republics can get together, because we'll have done so peacefully through internationalism. We won't have done it by fighting to try to keep them as long as we possibly can. That is what's happening now. Our ruling class now is denying Scotland's self-determination, and they'll do the same to Wales, as they've done to Ireland, with terrible, terrible consequences for such a long, long time in their history, at a terrible, terrible cost. So our internationalism should be to renounce that. That is self-determination. And we'll say to our friends in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, how about, now that you've got your own country, how about us coming together and forming a federal republic, either together or with the rest of Europe, possibly. You know, I think that's another possible. Maybe we'll all get together in a European Republican federal republic. I don't know exactly which direction it will go. So it's not that I disagree fundamentally with Kevin. It's just that it's all a discussion about what is the best route to get there. And I think the national question, as it's been developing in the last 20 years, tells us where that route should be.
Right, thank you very much, Steve. Okay, so I think we've had a really, really good discussion. And thank you to those people from the floor who came and asked questions and made contributions. It's now 19:33, so thank you everybody for your patience, and thanks to Kevin and Steve for all the work they put into this. And I'm sure that they will need to go and have a lie down now after all
in a darkened room, yeah,
after all their chat. So thank you both very much for being here, and I hope I hope we've highlighted this whole report, and I hope everyone will go away and really think about it and think about what their position is. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, Carol, for chairing. I'm going to go away now and write a new constitution.
Right, great.
Good. We want a new constitution.